We're now moving on to the second presenter in this section. Also an absolutely fantastic woman. Dr Leslie Cannold is Head of Programs at the Carolinas Centre for Ethical Leadership. She has pioneered the role of public ethicist and has been a regular columnist in a number of media outlets, including her present role as a regular contributor to Crikey. Of course, she was also absolutely instrumental from beginning to end in the fight for abortion rights in this country. Please welcome Leslie Cannold to the stage.
Okay, how's everyone going? Good. So I'm going to set up a timer because I'm nothing if not competitive. I also want to be on time, but I also want to thank Van for having the courage to talk about her faith. Yeah. And I feel really, I'm just amazed and so heartened by the fact that as a movement we've grown so much that we are really in a space now where we're fully kind of grasping all the potential of what secularism means and all the potential allies we have in the broadness and the base of this movement. So I think it's fantastic. So in case you think I'm someone who thinks it's a good idea to insult an audience when you start, I'm just wondering, in terms of my topic, which it's called It's About Democracy, Stupid, who in here recognizes the reference to that? What is it? Sorry? Yes. That's right. Okay, so it's about the Clinton election. I actually thought it was Clinton, so there you go, you're correcting me. But there was an idea that during Bill Clinton's election campaign that he had to keep reminding himself about what it was really about because it's so easy to kind of get off track. So I guess what I want to argue is that our goal is to preserve and extend Australia's secular democracy. I hope that's not a definition that offends anybody. But I guess my question is, what if there is no democracy? So if you remember anything from this talk, please remember this, okay? This is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. It is current, right now, okay? And if you can see the handly way I drew around Australia, the little green, and what you're seeing Australia butting up against is a line of in danger of severe polarization, typically called hyperpolarization. Okay, we are right on the cusp. And you can see along the bottom, entrenched, I do not feel these divisions can be overcome, so you get a sense of hopelessness. It's a really important figure. So what does it cash out to? It cashes out to a belief that 53% of us have that our country is more divided today than in the past. And you can see that we're not in the hyper-polarized space of Brazil and the Netherlands. In fact, the Netherlands just elected a xenophobic right-wing leader very recently. So things are very, very bad there. We're not where the US is, which is, as you can probably tell from my accent, where I'm originally from. But we're not in such a great place. We're moving along. It also means that we think things like, in Australia, the social fabric is weakening. The lack of civility and mutual respect today is the worst I have ever seen. Well more than half of us think that. And 54% think that the social fabric that once held this country together has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose. And finally, those who are feeling this sense of polarization most acutely, 24% of them would not help someone in need if that person strongly disagreed with their point of view. Now, if you really want to think about what is hyperpolarization, because it's a word you probably heard a lot, and you're going to hear a lot more of it, I think, unfortunately, I would say that kind of cuts right to it. It's this sense that other people are now so far away from us. We are so disdainful of them. We have so much contempt for them. We distrust them so profoundly that we wouldn't even help them if they were in need. That we wouldn't be willing to live in the same neighborhood. That we wouldn't be willing to have them as a coworker. And there's similar data, which kind of reminds me of, Van, your story, of people now saying that they would no longer be comfortable having their children, in the United States this is, if they're Republicans marrying a Democrat, and vice versa. Okay, so those figures are on the way up. It's bad. It's bad there, and it's starting to get bad here. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of hyperpolarization, which I would call the democratic harbinger of doom. So if you're hearing that word, hyperpolarization, we're becoming more polarized, we're becoming more hyperpolarized, that is a concern. And it's a concern because hyperpolarization is always at the core of when democracies die. So you get polarized. So that's where we are, right? We're still here. We're not in hyperpolarized yet, but we're right button up against it. So what have we got? We've got a growing identification as a progressive or a conservative and a decline in swinging voters. So people are starting to identify more in an identity sense. This is who I am. I vote for the Greens. I vote for the Democrats. I vote for Labor. I vote for whoever. That is part of me. And therefore, in partly what I'm doing when I'm voting is I'm telling you who I am. It's much less about I prefer this policy to that policy, although of course the policies kind of fold into it. These are all very complex phenomenon, but that's part of what's going on. You have an increased distance between the ideologies and values of both parties. So for everybody who remembers Venn diagrams, I was so unequal to the task of drawing one, I'm really sorry. But the theory was I was gonna draw those two intersecting circles where you get the Venn diagram in the middle. Well, that's where we used to be with our parties. So there used to be, like, the person who was on the far conservative side of Labor was pretty close to somebody who was on the pretty progressive side of the coalition. Now those circles have split. And when you get hyperpolarization, they split further. And so it means your centers and even your flanks are so far apart, you're starting to be in different worlds. You're starting to have no value commonality. And you're starting to, again, see other people as a problem, as not worthy of respect. You get a decline in agreed facts about key aspects of the nation's history, economy, society, and future objectives and challenges. You only have to think about the referendum to see where that was. You have a frustration at failure of the system to deliver results, which cashes out to a frustration with democracy. And I think if anyone's seen polling about how young people in general tend to feel about democracy, you can see they're not that big fans of it. It's better than it was a few years ago, but there is still a sense, and you can understand why, given what's happened with climate change, given the kind of housing crisis we have, given the cost of living, that many people, but particularly people who are particularly vulnerable, are not feeling like democracy is delivering for them. And then you get opponents starting to be seen in ways that start going towards contempt. Opponents are unreasonable, they're laughable, they're biased, they're condescending, or they're guilty of bad faith. So that then moves, you can kind of clearly see, over to hyperpolarized. That's where we're going. That's what I'd really like us not to get to. But it's what you're seeing, for instance, in the United States. This is a perfect characterization of what's now happening in the United States. So hyperpolarized, you get high levels of identification as a conservative or a liberal and near disappearance in swinging voters. There is practically nobody undecided in the United States anymore. Little to no overlap between the ideologies and values of both parties, your Venn diagram apart. Active and repetitive disputes about facts and their interpretation, leading to claims of deliberate cover-up, conspiracy, and lying. The big lie, obviously, was the massive one. Opponents are enemies who threaten all we hold dear. Opponents, they're not opponents anymore. They are enemies. And what are you justified to do to your enemies? How terrifying is it if your enemies get their hands on power? How justified would you be to just get in the way of that, since they're going to threaten everything you hold dear? Donald Trump was on a stage, had a lot more people in the audience than I do right now, but he was up on a stage saying, you know, you got to fight. You got to fight like hell or you won't have a country anymore. That is that. And finally, you get this disgust at the failure of this system to deliver desired outcomes, and with democracy leading to discussions of necessary coercion and violence. So you start justifying violence. You have no other choice. If the enemy took over, it would be too disastrous. It would destroy everything that you knew. So where are we? We're at Gallows for the premiere during COVID. That's Melbourne. Melbourne 2021? Someone help me out here. Yeah. And you also get people kind of happily with their caps, you know, smiling underneath the lovely photo opportunity. Is that the same as the gallows for the vice president on January 6th, which was, we now know, part of kind of Trump's last desperate attempt to stage a coup and to stay in power even though he'd lost a free and fair election? No, it's not exactly the same thing. But is it telling us that people are starting to think about violence as a way of solving political difference? Oh yeah, it definitely is. Okay, so we've done that, guys. So now I'm going the wrong way. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's talk about how democracies die. So this is a very, very imprecise description of what I'm seeing going on in our democracy right now. And the reason it's somewhat imprecise is because I would need a chart that kind of goes from almost the sky down to here to actually really map all the different forces and the ways that they interact and feed back on one another. So for the sake of actually being able to get something on a screen, I've simplified it, which is my way of saying if there's any democratic scholars in the audience, please forgive me. But I think I've kind of captured some key things that I think are really important for us to understand. So at the top, we have a democracy, right? But then in that big square, you start getting all of the things that I hope that many of you can recognize we are starting to see in our country. This is the polarization phase. We have attacks on secularism. We have economic shock. If anybody knows the history of the Second World War, they know that there was a huge economic shock in Germany that was very much a driver towards the dissolution of the Weimar Republic. Often there is an economic shock in the US as well. Reduction of shared facts. So some of these are causes, some of these are actually effects, but they're just signs that you should recognize as being risks to democracy. Economic inequality, nearly always there. Nearly always there. And if you think about the promise of democracy and how economic inequality shows its failure, I think you can understand in some ways why. Religious militancy, financial insecurity, security fears, anti-intellectualism. You see the rise of conspiracy theories. You see, often it'll say attacks on the press, but I think it's actually more specific than that. Nobody's attacking the Murdoch press. They're actually attacking the public interest-oriented, fact-driven journalism, because truth in all of this is really an enemy. And then once all of that kind of rains down, I tried to get my husband who was helping me with this to get rain, but it just didn't work. Once all this rains down, you start with this decline in optimism and trust. And that's where the Edelman barometer starts, is this problem with trust. Because trust is the invisible lubricant for all human relationships. We don't notice it, we don't talk about it. When it's not there, you got nothing. You have nothing in terms of your ability to trust your institutions or each other, and those two things keep winding into one another. If you can't trust what somebody says, if you can't trust they'll do what they're supposed to do, if you can't trust, you think, what's the point? What's the purpose of having this institution? I don't believe that it's actually going to do anything. So you get this decline in optimism and trust. It's never going to get better. I don't believe anything anybody says anyway. I don't think they're really doing what they're supposed to be doing. You get hyperpolarization. Sometimes that precedes, sometimes it comes after, but this is all part of the cycle. You get legislative gridlock. We're starting to see a little bit of that. You're seeing it at a massive level in the United States. They can't get anything done. They can't get anything done. They can't even properly fund the government anymore, and all they do is fight about it. That's a huge problem. I mean, you're a voter. This is how you're actually expressing your voice and trying to shape the society in which you live, and your representatives can't function. Of course, you're going to get very aggravated and think something's got to change. You start to dehumanize others. Dehumanization, as obviously we know it, there's kind of a never-ending font of it. But there is always a rise around these times in anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiment, and of course what's going on in Gaza at the moment isn't helping any of that. But there's always a group that you start to dehumanize. Why is that? Well, because you start to soften everybody up for the idea that certain people don't actually deserve rights. You know, I'm just talking about the trans people. I'm just talking about the Jews. But you soften everybody up to this idea that, oh, rights, you know, maybe some people deserve them, maybe some people don't. Very, very important. And of course, there's a practical component of that too, because we all really need to defend one another's rights, or when they come for ours, nobody's going to be around to defend you. We go on to assault on rights, all connected to the dehumanization story, so that's part of it. Then you get attacks on public interest journalism, which I've already spoken about, and then you start talking about violence being justified or threatened. And that's the really, really dangerous phase. Because if you're trying to kind of encapsulate in one simple sentence what a democracy is actually about, it's about solving our differences peaceably. It's finding ways to solve our differences in ways that throughout humanity we have mostly failed to do. Mostly when we disagree, we go to war. We have just enjoyed probably one of the longest kind of peace times to some degree, and I know we can quibble about all of that, but we haven't had another massive world war. That's in large part due to democracy. But democracy is on the slide right now. This is not just happening in the US, it's not just happening in the Netherlands, it's not just happening here. Democracies are on the slide all around the world. We don't completely understand what's driving it. I've tried to give you a little bit of a feel for some of the forces, but what we know is there's fewer and fewer. Last 17 years on the slide. And eventually you end up in an autocracy, a partial, a fragile democracy. Not the same as what we sometimes think about. It's not necessarily going to be a violent coup. What was supposed to happen in the United States was simply that Mike Pence was going to, do some shenanigans, and suddenly, Donald Trump just wasn't going to leave the White House, and it was going to be, if anything, a bloodless coup. Voting probably would continue. Typically in these sort of half-fragile quasi-democracies, you still vote. So if what you're thinking is, oh, well, it must still be a democracy because I'm voting, doesn't work that way. What if they suppress the opposition? What if they're not counting the votes fairly? Okay, so you have to have trust in the system, and you have to trust it because it's working. Those are the two things we don't have. Did everyone see that? Because I can go back again. I reckon these are the two things we're still missing for our little soup of how we actually slide into severe polarization or hyperpolarization. Right now, we don't have a strongman leader. I don't think Dutton's it. I hope I'm right, but I don't think he's it. I think Abbott had a crack at it. I think Clive Palmer had a crack at it. So far, nobody's tickled our fancy like the Orange Jesus. But we could get him any day now, and usually it is a him. Because when people are feeling like things are really chaotic and uncertain, many, many people have the impulse to want it to just be simpler. They want some kind of daddy figure to come in and make it all better. Oh dear. All right. Well, I'm going to skip these guys then, because there's some... Oh, I'm sorry. I know this is the bit where we get into the... Okay. Bad guys. And they're bad because they're authoritarian. So really the point I want to make here is that the problem that authoritarians are drawn to religion, not the other way around. And the problems with religion is when they're authoritarian. So I want us to really kind of keep that in mind. When we're concerned about religion, it's authoritarian tendencies, the desire to impose will over us, not individual faith and its beautiful offerings to anyone who wants to partake in it, and to which they are fully entitled as free and autonomous human beings. It is the authoritarian component of individuals and religion. So that's that. I think that's what we should do, but I can talk about that on the stage, so I'm going to skip it, don't yell. And I'm going to stop with another thing that I think we're missing, and it's always been a problem for our movement. We don't have enough of this spiritual nurturing stuff. We don't have enough of the stuff that draws us together. So what I wonder is, what would happen if we sponsored an Australian version of this ad? Six times I've seen it, 6 times I've cried. So anyway, that's what I will leave you with. I think that's kind of where we need to be going in terms of this space around the depolarization, in terms of the uniting, in terms of the kind of emotion and energy that I think we should bring to this movement, because I think this movement defines exactly what we need right now. Thank you.
Nice to see advertising used for good. instead of evil. Thank you so much, Leslie. That was extremely interesting and forensic in pointing out exactly where we're at and what we're risking. Made me think about some of my own attitudes and beliefs, and that perhaps I should remember that some of the people who I sometimes feel extremely negative about may also have a lot in common with me.